This young man right here in the sharp-looking checkered shirt.
Good afternoon again, Mr. President. Especially as it relates to human rights and social change, I'm Jermaine McKenzie, and I'm a focal point with the Global Fund Board. As it relates to human rights and social change, how do you make the decision to allow societies to go through the natural evolutionary process of having change occur on their own versus having governments exert policies to make these same political, social changes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's an interesting question, and it's one that I have to struggle with all the time. You know, every society, as I said, is at a different phase in development, in their own history. They have different cultural traditions. And so the way I think about it is that the United States has certain core values and principles that we believe deeply in. And you know, we don't necessarily expect that every country will formulate how to secure those ideals and those principles. We don't expect it to be done exactly as we do, any more than we expect every, obviously our democracy is not the same as a Jamaican democracy or a British democracy or Australian democracy, but we believe in democracy. We think that if people have the ability to speak out about their own lives, some sense of agency, then that society will be stronger. And that doesn't mean that we won't work with a country that doesn't precisely abide by those principles, but we will still speak out. There are times where a country is clearly engaging in activities that are so egregious that it's not culturally specific. It typically has to do with the government wanting to exert control over people and oppress them. And in those instances, I think it is entirely appropriate for us to speak out forcefully, and in some cases to not do business with them. I mean, you look at a country like North Korea. I mean, obviously Korean culture is different than American culture. On the other hand, you look at what's happening in South Korea and you look at what's happening in North Korea, and those are two entirely different societies. And I can tell you which one you'd rather live in. And if you have a situation in which people are being murdered simply because they didn't agree with the government on something or didn't want their economic fate to be entirely determined by the whims of some government bureaucrat, and suddenly they're sent to a labor camp, that's something where we as an international community have to speak out on. And then there's some, there's some issues that may be culturally specific, but you know what? I think they're wrong. I won't, we're not going to try to force that country to change, but I may try to shame that country. There are nations where slavery still exists. And that may be, part of the ancient culture in that society, but slavery is wrong. And I'm not going to give them the excuse that, well, this is who we are. In Africa, and I can speak, I think, fairly as somebody who's the son of an African father, there are practices like female genital mutilation that may be part of the tradition there, but it's wrong. And I'm going to say so. And it'll be U.S. policy to say that it's wrong. So the tools we use to try to bring about change around the world may vary. And as I said earlier, we're not always perfectly consistent. There are times where we've got allies who are not observing all the human rights we would like. And there are times where there are countries that are adversaries of ours where they do some things quite well. You can't expect us or any country to be perfectly consistent in every circumstance. But what I've tried to do is be fairly consistent in terms of what we believe, what we stand for, and then we use different tools depending on what we think will bring about the most change. In some cases, it'll just be a diplomatic statement. In some cases, it may be serious enough that we will try to organize the United Nations or other multilateral forums to speak out against certain practices. In some cases, it may be so egregious that we need to sanction them, and we will try to organize the international community in that way. And then finally, in the ultimate circumstance, where the violations of our values are so severe that they start spilling over, and in the instance of, for example, genocide, we may say to ourselves, in concert with the international community, we need to intervene, because this government is so brutal and so unacceptable that we need to protect people. But we do that in the context of an international conversation, so that we're not simply making these decisions, or we're not so arrogant that we're not paying attention to what the rest of the world community is saying. Okay? This young lady who I originally had called on and got skipped over. No, this one right here. Yeah. Right here. I'm sorry, I love you too, though. I mean, I just...
Good afternoon, Mr. President. My name is Katrina King-Smith. I'm from the Turks and Caicos Islands. My question is two-part as well. Firstly, in countries such as the Turks and Caicos Islands, where the population is small and our main sources of revenue are tourism and foreign direct investment, I was wondering if you can suggest two ways that the government may better generate and regulate sustainable revenue, especially with regulations currently being put in place to close offshore financial centers. And secondly, I was wondering if after your term has ended, would you mind coming to the Turks and Caicos to vacation?
On the second question, absolutely. Well, I'll do some island hopping once I'm out of office. And you guys can show me all the good places to go. On this issue of offshore financial centers, we respect each country to set up its own financial regulations, and we recognize that for small countries, that providing services, including financial services, may be an important source of revenue. The one thing that we have to make sure of is that these financial centers are not either used for illicit money laundering or tax avoidance by large U.S. corporations that set up, cutouts or front organizations, but as a practical matter are, operating in the United States, employing folks in the United States, essentially headquartered in the United States, and yet somehow their mailing address is such and such island where they have to pay no taxes. Those are the kinds of egregious concerns that we're trying to deal with. I think we try to take it on a case-by-case basis, and in my CARICOM meeting that I just had, this issue was brought up. There were a number of leaders who expressed concern that maybe they were being unfairly labeled as areas of high financial risk. And what I committed to them is we will examine their complaints and go through in very concrete ways where our concerns are and how our governments can work together. More broadly, I think that if you look at some of the most successful countries in the world, they're actually pretty small countries, like Singapore, for example, that on paper look like they have no assets. And yet, if you go to Singapore, it has one of the highest standards of living in the world. What is it that Singapore did that might be replicable? Well, one of the most important things they did was they made a massive investment in their people. And if you've got a highly skilled, highly educated workforce, if you set up rules of law and governance that are transparent and non-corrupt, then you can attract actually a lot of service industries to supplement the tourist industry, because people would want to locate in your country. You could envision people wanting to operate and have offices there where you've got a trained workforce. And these days, so many businesses are operating over the internet that if you've got a really skilled workforce that provides value added, you will attract companies and you'll attract businesses. What deters people from investing in most countries is conflict, corruption, and a lack of skills or infrastructure. And those countries that are able to address those problems, have rule of law, and eliminate corruption, make sure that you are investing in the education of your people, and it's a continuous education. It doesn't just stop at the lower grades, but you give people constant opportunities to upgrade their skills. You have a decent infrastructure. You're going to be able to succeed. That's the recipe, the formula for a 21st century economy.